Yeah.
Oh, to the questions, what is poverty and how should we define it in the United States? We hold that poverty is a state of being that prevents an individual or group from being dignified within their community, wherein they lack the freedom to actualize key capabilities and are faced with barriers that they cannot surmount and are unable to participate in numerous facets of society.
Specifically, our approach to analyzing poverty advocates for a capabilities-based approach that is regionally, temporally, and culturally relative in order to further understand the well-being of people. We find most measures of poverty to be misguided in that they lose focus on the apparent truth that the primary purpose of tracking poverty is to alleviate human suffering.
Before we get into our analyses of the system we advocate, it is worth discussing the current definition of poverty as measured by the United States government. The current standard is referred to as the Official Poverty Measure, or OPM. It is an absolute measure of poverty, meaning it does not change as standards of living in the U.S. rise. It is also a binary system, meaning one is considered either in or not in poverty based on a threshold that is calculated by taking the price of the so-called economy food plan, which is effectively a low-price basket of goods providing one with all the nutrition they need to live, times 3. The multiplying of the food price times 3 is predicated on consumer spending data from the 60s, which showed that households spent approximately one-third of their budget on food.
Take, for example, two families who, on paper, have the same amount of income and are living below the poverty threshold. While it may seem that they are equally struggling, one family may be in a position where a substantial amount of that income is spent paying off medical expenses for an ill family member, leaving that family with less money to spend on resources that they need. When solely looking at income, it may not be apparent that one household is doing much better off than the other, especially if they have other support not measured as income, even though on paper, it seems that they are living in the same conditions. This we believe to be the inherent flaw in the current measurement system of America.
The threshold itself is adjusted for the size of the family being evaluated and for inflation utilizing the Consumer Price Index. And while these adjusting factors are necessary, the OPM's use in the 21st century is problematic in several areas. For one, it doesn't adjust itself for regional differences in cost of living, meaning it acts as if housing costs were roughly the same in San Francisco as in the rural Midwest. Furthermore, the OPM assumes that the 21st century family still spends approximately one-third of its budget on food, an assumption that simply doesn't hold up anymore. Finally, the OPM hasn't been updated to reflect the fact that increasingly, unmarried persons may cohabit the same property, and the OPM does not count unmarried cohabitants as being a family. The OPM calculates family resources in a problematic manner, which fails to account for the diversity of income forms. To determine income, the OPM solely includes a family's gross pre-tax income and cash welfare. This doesn't take into account things like in-kind benefits, such as the new Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, and near-cash benefits, like the Earned Income Tax Credit. This problematic methodology causes the OPM to calculate an inaccurate estimate of a family's true resources, which hampers its ability to determine people's well-being. Newer attempts have been made to measure poverty, a primary example being the SPM. The SPM, or Supplemental Poverty Measure, is certainly an improvement on the OPM, as it accounts for numerous forms of income present in the 21st century, such as in-kind and near-cash benefits. It also subtracts non-discretionary expenses such as taxes when calculating resources. For its threshold, it takes the 33rd percentile of expenditures on food, clothing, shelter, and utilities, multiplied by 1.2 to account for additional standard expenses. Like the OPM, it is adjusted for cost of living increases. However, it goes further in that it uses a more inclusive definition of the family.
So while the SPM is at least a more accurate measure than the OPM, we can still find key flaws in its methodology. For one, if we accept the premise that poverty is concerned with people's well-being, then the SPM must purport to establish a causal link between income and well-being. And while the two are often correlated, a direct causal link does not exist. A number of other factors such as race, gender, or locality may prevent a household from converting their resources into goods, services, and opportunities as easily, and could therefore be worse off than the family with less resources. Effectively, any poverty measure that uses income as its sole or even primary measuring factor is inherently problematic and doesn't truly provide us with an accurate picture of people's well-being, which is the whole point of analyzing poverty in the first place.
This leads us to our proposed system of poverty analysis, a capabilities-based approach. Rather than following the OPM and SPM and using a research-based approach in analyzing human well-being, we contend that it's more accurate to examine the combined central capabilities any given individual or group has. This we can measure by the functionings of each household. This approach to analyzing poverty is best summarized by Nussbaum, as she claims that, quote, the capabilities approach can be provisionally defined as an approach to comparative quality of life assessment and to theorizing about basic social justice. It holds that the key question to ask when comparing societies and assessing them for their basic decency or justice is, What is each person able to do and to be? End quote. The amount of human dignity that an individual has can be directly correlated to varying degrees of each of these capabilities, wherein if an individual lacks all of them, we would determine that they are in fact living in extreme poverty. The inability to reach one's full potential tends to be indicative of social exclusion, which is a defining characteristic of poverty. This tends to be why many people associate deprivation of material resources such as clothing, food, and housing with poverty. We propose that the reasoning these items are essential to the well-being of a household is because when one doesn't have these essentials, they may be prone to sickness, violence, or worse, humiliation and depression, which may limit their other capabilities.
We are not so much concerned that people do not have the essential food, housing, or clothing they need, but rather that they lack the choice to live how they wanted to in the first place. We propose that whether or not an individual chooses to eat 2,000 calories a day should be up to them. But if they lack the choice even to eat 2,000 calories in a day, they are lacking a capability to choose how and when they will eat.
Poverty, as determined by our capabilities approach, will be seen in various forms and would take into account the varying degrees of a household's capabilities by quantifiably measuring their functionings, amounts of each of these capabilities, but in poverty. In this theory, capabilities are effectively the set of all possible beings and doings, to borrow Sen's phrase, that an individual has available to his or herself. Within the set of capabilities are one's functionings, or their actual beings and doings. They can be thought of as actualized capabilities. A person can have the internal capability without the functioning, but not the other way around. For example, a female could grow up in a society where she has the money to afford a college education, but due to political or religious barriers, she is prevented from receiving an education she wishes to pursue, which would be the achievement or functioning.
Our preference for understanding the capabilities and functionings of an individual is grounded in our motivation for the analysis in the first place, to understand how well people are actually doing. It's not that income does not affect people's well-being. In fact, we acknowledge that income often directly affects one's set of capabilities, just as one's capabilities affect one's income. The reason we prefer a capabilities-based approach is the apparent fact that the only reason income matters is precisely because it often expands one's set of capabilities. So therefore, we argue that it's preferable to analyze the capabilities directly as a subtraction to income, doesn't have a set relationship, and can obscure the actual reality of individuals' well-being. And as we previously discussed, income-based approaches don't always yield reliable results for what we are concerned with. However, the approach we advocate for focuses directly on the capabilities that are directly responsible for one's well-being. It's a more direct approach and certainly isn't without its drawbacks.
With that in mind, as well as knowing that income can be directly indicative and causing of one's capabilities, it can be used as an indicator of whether or not people are living without autonomy or dignity. The duration of time that they are experiencing such lack of choice in their lives will also be a factor in measuring their overall degree of poverty endured. Rather than implying there is one threshold of poverty, our claim is that there is an ever-changing poverty line that moves depending on the changes in capability as well as income or duration of time in poverty.
One way of thinking about poverty contends that one is in poverty if and only if they don't have access to basic goods needed to sustain life. Robert Rector implicitly uses this understanding of poverty when he describes the average living conditions of Americans living in poverty and how the government's definition of poverty includes people that have access to goods above what everyday Americans understand poverty ought to be.
And while his work deserves merit in its task to confront misconceptions about the current definition of poverty, we still reject his understanding of poverty as lack of goods needed for survival.
Our reasoning for this is simple. Having just enough to physically maintain life in no way entails almost any level of well-being for an individual. For example, we can imagine a prisoner that's provided with enough food, clothing, and shelter to live, but has zero access to entertainment, other humans, recreation, space, and books. This inmate is permanent solitary confinement will theoretically be able to sustain life, but it's difficult to argue that he or she is actually doing well. If we employed this standard, our poverty rate might drop drastically, but this is just a simple statistical change. It won't actually cause anyone to be doing any better. In fact, it's likely to serve as a justification to cut down on welfare policies, which would only put people in a worse position.
It is difficult to offer a quantifiable scale to a qualitative approach. There is a bare minimum, however, to the quality of life a human is entitled to. The best way to measure this is through the functionings households achieve, which tell us about their capabilities and income, which is likened to their overall autonomy in life. Even though there will be individuals not accounted for in our standards, we are making an attempt at having a greater understanding of how our neighbors are actually doing.
Now that we've come to the end, we'd like to explain why we think measuring poverty is important. There are people living in poverty all around us, and people live in different circumstances that aren't always seen by the numbers. We hope that by attempting to accurately measure humanity's circumstances and conditions, we can achieve our ultimate goal, equity and well-being.